Okay, so we learned yesterday, just in very brief, that you cannot pressure someone um, unless you know for a fact, or at least there's a reasonable assumption that this person has the means to give and just is being miserly. But if you don't know, then you can't put pressure on anyone to give, even though it's a community effort. So the source of this is as follows. He says, "Hine b'shulchan aruch kosav v'zelashono Adam shua shenotein tzedakah yoter meharoilo." Now that term shua is not a familiar term, but as we'll see, it's an overly generous person, right? Oshe meitzar la'atzmo b'notein lagabai kadesh lo yitbayesh. Or it's not that he's overly generous, but he is very much wants to avoid embarrassment. So he forces himself to give, even though he doesn't have the money to support himself. Asr lutovo ulagabos mimenu tzedakah. You're not allowed to pressure that person or even ask him for tzedakah. V'hagabai shemachlimo b'shol mimenu. And if a gabai knows this fellow is not capable of giving and embarrasses him and asks him, so Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lipara Mimenu Aikan Lashanu. God will eventually exact punishment from the Gabai, Tzedakah. Umekoro Meha Rambam, it's based in the Rambam. And he says, Uviprisha Hisbir Sha'adam Shua Hainu Nadiv Lev Gadol Shenotein Yoter Meyacholto. He says the definition, according to the Prisha, of an Adam Shua is a person who's extremely generous and gives more than he can. And a person who pains himself, that's the language, to give, is a person who can't afford it at all, but just gives because he's too embarrassed to admit that he doesn't have the money. And the Prisha adds that not only can I not put any pressure on these individuals, but I'm not even allowed to ask them for tzedakah if I know that this is their financial status. And the Meiri writes as follows: Afal pisha amru mimashchanin al tzedakah, roi legabai, shelo lemashkein v'shelo lahachriach bekach. He says, even though the Gemara does say that if a person is miserly and does not participate in the community fundraising effort, you can even forcibly confiscate some of his assets, and you can put pressure on him to give. He says, but that's only true. Elamishu muchzak ba'osher v'shiyachol litain kamoshu matil alav. That's only when you know that the person can afford it and is perfectly capable of participating in the effort. But if you know that he doesn't have the ability, he can't afford it, then you should not place any pressure on him. And you certainly should not ask anyone who is an honored member of the community, but you know that he's fallen on hard times. In other words, you have situations like this where people used to be quite wealthy, and then they lost their fortune. That person you have to be extra sensitive to, not to ask them. And there, because you know that the person would be humiliated by saying, I can't afford it, I can't give, you have to be extra careful not to ask him. And anyone who puts any kind of pressure on such a person, rasha, then you're called a rasha. And the Gemara has very stern things to say about a community leader who places undue pressure upon a community. That's called shalol l'shem shemaim, not for the sake of heaven. And v'zehu sha'amru, and the Gemara states about such a person, ufakadati al kolo chatzav, I shall exact vengeance on all those who pressure my people. Elu gabai tzedakah Umisha misbon. This refers to a gabbai tzedakah who puts undue pressure. Umisha mitbonein bekach ve'eno machriach misha eno roi lekach. He says, but if a person really is sensitive to this, and really he contemplates this, and does not put any pressure on someone who can't afford it, he says, and furthermore, a gabbai tzedakah who does not refrain from pressuring someone who can afford it. In other words, he is judicious in the way that he knows how to go to each individual. Like he'll go to the individual who he knows can't afford it and says, don't worry, I got you covered. And he goes to the more wealthy balabas who he knows can afford it and says, I'm not letting this go until I get a certain number from you. And that takes a lot of chutzpah sometimes. Harehu bichlal shoftei tzedek adanin din emes la'amito. This is about such a person. He is called a dan din emes. He is a judge who judges truthfully, and he is worthy of great reward. Such a person. So looking at these texts, hare mima shekasav roi legabai shalol mashkein v'shalol hachriach bekach ela mishim mutzlak ba'osher. He says it seems from the language that you should only pressure someone who is known to be wealthy. He's going to point out that there seems to be a discrepancy in the language. It seems to say from the first part that you can only pressure someone who you know has the means, right? And therefore, if you have no knowledge of this person's financials whatsoever, then you wouldn't be allowed to pressure him. But it also seems that to just simply ask a person without putting any pressure, that would be fine if you have no knowledge of their financial status. I haven't found anyone who disagrees with that premise. And therefore it seems that the Rambam would agree. Right? It's only that you're not even allowed to ask someone if he's the type of person who gives more than he can afford it. And therefore, in most cases, the members of the community are really unknown to the gabbai tzedakah as far as their financial status, because a person can come across as being financially secure when they're not, and vice versa. And therefore, ha'im kvar nasan mashu chayav odilma matzav kasha ve'en b'yacholtu latet. First of all, I don't know how much you've given in the past, whether you fulfilled your obligation of tzedakah, and I also don't know what your financial status is. And therefore, mimela misafek asur legabai lilchotz alav, and therefore it's not permitted for a gabbai tzedakah to place any pressure. The Meiri says this: you can only pressure someone who you know for a fact, right? And that's not always so easy to know. And then the Prisha just adds, and this is the source for what we said above, that if you did put undue pressure and you got a larger gift than perhaps the person was capable of affording, you're not obligated to give it back to him. And then he brings down from Rav Moshe an interesting shaila. He says, Ayin igros Moshe shadani mutar legalot la'acherim sheploni nasan lo tzedakah. He says that Rav Moshe has an interesting shaila. Are you allowed to reveal to other people that so-and-so gave you a nice gift? In other words, you know how these mishluchei mitzvah have a network, right? And they compare notes, right? So Rav Moshe basically was asked the question, I am working for Yeshiva X. I just collected a very nice check from a balabas who's under the radar. Am I allowed to share this information with others that so-and-so is a wealthy man and he's gave me a nice gift? He writes as follows, Ella afshe kishikvar nosam litzdaka kol maser shalo. Nami mistaver shad chomesh rashai gam adam golo levakesh mimenu. Veleka mizeh mishum ufo kadati al lo chatzav. Me'achar shemitzvah min amuvchar hu litein ad chomesh k'deisa b'shulchan aruch. So he says, first of all, maybe the person has already given a tenth already he's already tithed, and you don't want him to feel obligated to someone to go above and beyond his tithe. So Rav Moshe says to dispel that, he says, you can give up until a fifth, and maybe the person would be happy to do that. V'gamim kvar nasan chomesh litzdaka lo yitbayesh milomar zeh afla adam hayoter gadol v'lo yitva mimenu shuv. And you can also assume that if a person has given his quota, even he's given 20% of his income to tzedakah, why would you think he would be embarrassed? Anyone who's given tzedakah and has done their quota, he'll just be honest with the person who does the ask and say, I'm sorry, I've already made my distributions for this year. The kevin shavadei adayin lo nasan maaser derov ha'inshi osin ha'cheshbon v'sof hashana uvichlal lo matzi kol kach hashirim deyitnu meiser v'kol shkein shein lachush. He says, and therefore, Rav Moshe concludes that's certainly that there's no reason to assume that this person has exhausted all of his gifts if it's in the middle of the year, because usually most people make their cheshbon by, at around Rosh Hashanah time. And he says, he says, and it's very hard to find wealthy people who do give a full tithe. And you don't have to fear, it's very unlikely that he's already given away 20%. He says, not only are you permitted to share the information with others that this person is a generous, charitable person, but it's a mitzvah to share this with other charitable institutions. He says, and therefore there's no reason for any Baal Tzedakah to have any grievance against a fundraiser who shares this information with others. The Adarabba, Yeshlo lahakir tovalo al shagarm sheyitin yoter litzdaka. If anything, this person should have hakara satov. God has blessed me with wealth, and I should say to you, shkoyach for sending me the long line of mishulachim who are now at my door, because you've given me the opportunity to give more tzedakah. So that's Rav Moshe's position. He says, not only is there no prohibition for a fundraiser to share information about a gift that someone gave him, but it's even a mitzvah because you're giving that ashir the opportunity to do more mitzvahs.
Your work, there's so many organizations that there's a feeling that I would imagine fundraisers that they want to, it's very competitive.
Yes, it is very competitive. Well, that's the thing. It depends on which league you're playing in. If you're playing in the minor leagues, then I think you're right that many times when you're seeking gifts from, let's say, people who were middle class, right, or upper middle class, these people may make one major gift, and then all of the other gifts are not major gifts. Because there's so many good causes. You've got your Magen David Adom, and you've got your Chai Lifeline, and you've got your Hatzalah, and your Zaka, and your this and your that, and this soup kitchen and that soup kitchen. And it could be that if you're in a league where you're seeking out to donors from that donor base, I could really hear what Ron is saying. Is that maybe if I'm an executive director of a particular organization, I want to protect my donor. But at the same time, if you're playing in the major leagues and you're dealing with people who are major philanthropists of multiple, and they have their names on many different buildings and things like that, So then maybe Rav Moshe's principle would apply. It all depends. I think your point, though, is well taken, Ron. It really all depends on the situation and on the status of the donor. So, but what he wants to extract from what Rav Moshe has said is that V'leka bazeh mishum ufakarati al kolo chatzav me'acher shemitzvah min hamubchar hu liten ad chomesh. Rav Moshe says, don't worry about that person being overtapped. First of all, because he says it's unlikely that a person who's wealthy has already given 20% of his income to charity. He says, Nira shalamrot she'en chiyav loses yoser mimaiser, v'chol zeh mutar lilchotz kadei she'yiten chomesh keben sheyesh b'zeh mitzvah min hamubchar. He says, even though there's no obligation for a person to give 20% of his income to tzedakah, Rav Moshe seems to say that since there's still a mitzvah, in other words, it's a mitzvah min hamuvchar, it's like an additional mitzvah that's not obligatory, but you go above and beyond, and you get even more reward for doing the mitzvah in the best possible way. Rav Moshe seems to feel that there's no problem in allowing that person to have his door knocked down, or to feel pressure to give more. He says, and it seems very bizarre. How could you even justify putting pressure on someone to give more than what they're obligated to give? It's one thing to ask them; it's another thing to say that you can put pressure. So it could be that Rav Moshe was not precise in his language, and maybe he didn't mean pressure. But he says, but al kol panim, he says, ulam ein lismoch al zeh kedei lahatir lami shematrim lemosad lahagzim b'misbar talmidim b'kavana sheha'asher yiten chomesh. He says, but you can't rely on this to give a heter to someone who's a fundraiser to exaggerate the number of students, like we've discussed in the past. And maybe your intention is because you want the person to give more, and you want him to give even more than his 10%. The tachen shelo Yosef bitzdaka ela shebiglal sheyiten yoter laoto mosad yiten pachad lemosad acher. It says because in general, when you're dealing with philanthropists, they're generally going to be giving to multiple institutions. By exaggerating the number or by lying about your enrollment, it's not that you're doing something wrong by pressuring him to give more than what he can afford. But what you are doing is you're creating liability for other legitimate institutions, because if you are a good salesman and you get him to give more to your institution, he's just going to end up pulling back on his other institutions. He says, and furthermore, it's the donor's prerogative who he's going to give his meiser to. And if by you lying to him, by you misrepresenting your enrollment, you're actually taking away that person's ability to use proper discretion in choosing which institutions he wants to support. And all right, anyway, I'm not going to go through it. It just seems to be like we're beating a dead horse. In other words, bottom line is you're not allowed to put pressure on someone who you're not allowed to put pressure on anyone except the person who has not given his proper share to charity. Well, I don't think that there's a way to 100% know that, but there are ways there. Let's say it's a community endeavor. Let's say, we have, like in the shul, we have this thing called Binyan Habayit, where we solicit people who are of a higher bracket if they would consider, participating in membership on a higher scale. So It all depends. If a person is a philanthropist in the community and is giving to every single religious institution, so then there's nothing wrong with going over to that person and saying, you really belong in this group. You're in that bracket of philanthropists. So why shouldn't you give? In other words, I don't see anything wrong with putting pressure on that person because you see that he's got a record of giving. And he can always say, you know what? When I choose my gifts, I give to these institutions because they need it. I think that the shul is a good cause. I pay my membership. I don't want to give more. And he can say that. But so you're not pressuring him. The pressure is not causing him embarrassment in that kind of situation. He's not embarrassed. He's decided that he doesn't want to give to the shul anymore, and that's fine. Okay, let's take a look at Begeder Chiyuv Tzedakah U'Maiser Ksafim. Let's take a look at the next shaila, the obligation of tzedakah versus tithing. She'ela, Levi eno batuach sheyachol lekabel al atzmo latet ma'aser kamo shenohagu hayom. So Levi is a struggling young father, and he's not sure whether he can take upon himself the commitment to give 10% of his net income to tzedakah. And if you recall, we had learned that the Torah's mitzvah of tzedakah is not a tithe. It's just to give a minimal amount every year to charity. But there has become a rabbinic tradition, can't even say it's an obligation, but it's a tradition that a Jew should make every effort to tithe his income. So Levi's not sure if he can take that on. At this point in his career, he's not sure whether he has that level of disposable income. Okay? Ulam biritzono latet litzdaka kefi mashu hu chayav meikar hadin. So, but he does want to fulfill his halachic obligation. So, v'lochein hu shoel eich nikba shiur hatzdaka shekol echad chayav latet meikar hadin. So he knows the halacha. He knows that tithing is a tradition, but not an absolute obligation. So he wants to know, what is my absolute obligation? Per year, how much must I give? So the response to that question is as follows. Aklalhu shechiyuv hatzdaka nimdad lefi hatzrachim shel ha'aniyim. He says the general rule is that the obligation for tzedakah incumbent upon each individual depends upon the status of the poor that he finds himself surrounded by. V'im ein aniyim ein chiyuv klal. If there are no poor people that are knocking on his door, then there's no obligation at all to give tzedakah. Kemo kein hachiyuv mitchalek bein b'nei ha'ir. And furthermore, the obligation of supporting the poor is shared by all of the other members of the community. V'lachein rak beis din sheyodea kama aniyim yesh v'yodea ma hatzrachim shelahem v'kama ashirim yesh v'hayechola shekol echad ve'achad. And therefore, only someone who's, let's say, a Rav or the beis din, who really knows the number of poor people that are on the dole in the community. They know what the financial needs of the various institutions that are providing essential services to the community. They know what the philanthropic gifts were for, let's say, last year. They know how many wealthy people there are who can afford to support these institutions. Only they can make a fair assessment as to how much each person should give per annum in order to participate in the community's share of supporting these institutions. And you'll probably never get to an exact dollar amount, but you could certainly get a ballpark amount. In other words, let's say we have X number of aniyim in the community who are living below the poverty line. So that is to say that after they get all of their is it called welfare here in Canada? So they're on welfare. These aniyim that are part of we're talking about the Jewish community now. You have aniyim who are getting welfare checks. They're getting rent subsidies. They're getting all of the government grants that they can in order to be able to live above poverty. But they also need additional money for their children's education, for their children's clothing, et cetera, et cetera. And you know that, let's say there are 100 people in the Toronto Jewish community who qualify, and each one probably needs about $10,000 extra per year. And so that means that we have what is it, 100 people times 10,000 would be $1 million. So you know you need $1 million per year to support the poor in the community. So based on that, then you see, well, how many residents of the Jewish community in Toronto are there? Of that $1 million that are needed, let's say $750,000 are covered by the big philanthropists in the community. And there's $250,000 shortfall in this fund that we use to provide for these poor people. So let's say that there are 2,500 other people in the community. That means that each person would be responsible for $100. Okay, so that would indicate to this young man who needs to know what is my fair share to be able to share in the community needs. That would be the answer. Now, notice he's not talking about all of the other charitable institutions, the yeshivas and the shuls and the mikvahs and the and Chai Lifeline and NCSY and JLIC and Small Wonders and Tomchei Shabbos and right, Bikra Cholim, right? So all of those additional institutions do not fall under the rubric of necessary gifts. So basically what he's telling us is that it's not only dependent upon the ability of the donor, because he's giving, let's say, he knows he's giving far less than a tenth. He's not going to be able to tithe his income. He's just squeaking by. But he wants to give a minimal gift to be able to do his share within the community. It really all depends upon the number of poor people that are part of the Jewish community. And that's something to be assessed by, let's say, the Beis Din. I would also suggest that in a community like ours, a major metropolitan community, maybe the UJA would have those figures. They probably have those figures as far as what the needs are in the community, what the shortfall is. And I'll be honest with you, it could be there is no shortfall. It could be in a community like ours, they're not operating at a deficit. They may be even operating at a surplus because there's so many philanthropists in a city like Toronto. This is a very generous community when it comes to philanthropic gifts. And so and there's a lot of wealth in the community, thank God, a lot of what you would say is multi-generational wealth that was passed down in trusts and foundations and things like that. So for all we know, there's plenty of money to feed every single poor Jew in Toronto, in the GTA. And if there is poverty, it's only because these individuals either are too proud or are not connected to the sources of those funds. But there's plenty of money out there. And therefore, it could be that in a community like ours, the person would not have more than an obligation to give $1 a year to tzedakah if he can't tithe. He wants to know, what is my obligation to share in the communal needs? And so that's the response. Okay, now we'll look at the source in the Shulchan Aruch Imrei Hashem tomorrow, and then we'll try and let me just see if there's. We haven't finished the psak over here. He says, "V'keven sheshir hatzdaka tolui lefi hamamon, dahainu behayecholet shel kol echad ve'echad." He says, and therefore, since the shear of how much tzedakah I'm supposed to give is dependent upon how much each person is capable of, it could be that the communal needs that are imposed upon each member of the community will sometimes be less than 10%, and sometimes it'll be more than 10% of this guy's income. And we'll continue this idea in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. Okay?